3 days after I gave birth to my daughter, my husband walked into my hospital room with another woman on his arm and a manila envelope in his hand. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't look at the baby sleeping in the bassinet beside my bed. He walked straight to me, dropped that envelope on my lap, and said 5 words that split my life in half. Sign. I only want the baby. I looked at him. I looked at the woman standing behind him in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed and a smile on her face like she was watching a show she already knew the ending to. Her name was Corinne Voss. I'd learned later that she'd been sleeping with my husband for almost 2 years. But in that moment, all I saw was a woman who looked at me the way you look at something you're about to throw away. Corinne tilted her head and said, "You'll be homeless by Friday, sweetheart. You don't even have a bank account he hasn't already emptied." My husband, Dominic Fox, stood there and didn't correct her, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just watched me with his jaw set, waiting for me to fall apart the way he'd trained me to fall apart over 4 years of marriage. Quietly, obediently, with no fight left in me, and I'll admit something to you right now. 3 months earlier, he would have been right. 3 months earlier, I would have crumbled in that bed, signed whatever he put in front of me, and watched him walk out with my daughter and my dignity in the same hand. Because that's what 4 years of living under Dominic Fox's control had done to me. He had spent our entire marriage making me smaller, quieter, more dependent, more afraid, and for most of that time, it worked. But something had changed, something he didn't know about, something that had been put into motion 8 weeks before I ever went into labor, by a 74-year-old woman who had raised me from the age of 6 and who had never once in her life let a man take what belonged to her family, my grandmother, Opal Hadley. I picked up the pen from the envelope. I didn't open the papers. I didn't read a single word. I signed every page, one after another, while Dominic watched me with his mouth slightly open, because this was not the reaction he had planned for. He expected tears. He expected begging. He expected me to clutch that baby and scream that he couldn't take her from me. Instead, I signed, calmly, steadily, every single page. Corinne let out a short laugh from the doorway. "I told you she wouldn't even fight," she said to Dominic. "I told you she was nothing." I handed the pen back to my husband. I looked him dead in the eyes and I said nothing, not one word. And then the nurse standing beside my bed, a woman named Patrice Langford who had been adjusting my IV and watching this entire scene unfold without a word, leaned down close to my ear, close enough that only I could hear, and she whispered 4 words. "Good. Now everything can proceed as planned." Dominic didn't hear her. Corinne didn't hear her. They collected the papers, exchanged a look of victory between them, and walked out of my room like they had just won a war. The door closed behind them and the room went silent, except for the sound of my daughter breathing in her bassinet. Patrice locked the door. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and said, "He signed them too, Miss Opal. Boyd was right. He used the exact language we expected. It's done." My name is Jolene Hadley. I was 31 years old, lying in a hospital bed 3 days after delivering my baby girl, and the 2 people who had just tried to destroy my life had no idea that they had walked into a trap that my grandmother had been building for months. What happened over the next 90 days didn't just save my daughter. It didn't just save my home. It dismantled every lie, every scheme, every hidden dollar, and every secret that Dominic Fox had spent 4 years constructing, and by the time it was over, the man who told me to sign walked out of a courtroom with nothing. Not the baby, not the house, not the money he'd hidden, not even the woman he'd thrown me away for. This is how it happened, all of it, from the beginning. I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a house that leaned a little to the left when the wind blew hard and had a porch that creaked so loud you could hear someone coming from 50 feet away. My grandmother Opal said that was a feature, not a flaw. She said a woman should always hear trouble before it reaches her front door. Opal raised me from the time I was 6 years old, after my parents, her son, and his wife were killed in a head-on collision on Route 119 during a rainstorm. I don't remember the funeral. I remember the morning after, sitting at Opal's kitchen table eating oatmeal with honey, and her sitting across from me saying, "You're mine now, Jolene, and I don't lose what's mine." She meant it, every word. She worked as a seamstress for 30 years, taking in alterations, hemming wedding dresses, patching work uniforms for the men at the coal processing plant. She never made much money, but she never owed anyone a dime, and she never once let me feel like I was less than any child in that county. I went to school. I kept my grades up. I got a scholarship to the community college's veterinary technician program because I'd always loved animals and because Opal told me to pick a career where I'd be needed no matter what the economy did. People always have animals, she said, and animals always need someone who knows what they're doing. She was right. I graduated. I got a job at the Harlan County Animal Clinic, a small practice run by a man named Dr. Alton Pogue, who'd been treating livestock and house pets since before I was born. I loved that job. I loved the routine, the animals, the way every day had a purpose. I made enough to cover my rent, my truck payment, and a little extra for Opal's groceries. I wasn't rich. I wasn't trying to be. I was steady, and that was enough. And then I met Dominic Falk, and steady stopped being enough for him the moment he decided I was useful. I met him at a regional veterinary supply conference in Lexington. He was working a booth for a pharmaceutical company, handing out samples and brochures with that smile of his, the one that made you feel like you were the only person in a room full of hundreds. He asked my name. He asked where I was from. He asked if I wanted to get coffee after the expo closed, and when I said yes, he looked at me like I'd just given him a gift he didn't deserve. That was the trick. That was always the trick with Dominic. He made you feel like loving him was a generous thing you were doing, not a trap you were walking into. Within 2 months, he was driving to Harlan County every weekend to see me. He brought flowers, he brought dinner, he sat on Opal's porch and drank sweet tea and called her ma'am and asked her about her sewing. Opal was polite to him, the way she was polite to everyone. But I remember one night after he left, she stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and said, "That man listens real carefully, Jolene. But I haven't figured out yet if he's listening because he cares or because he's collecting." I should have listened to her then. I didn't. I was 27 years old and no man had ever paid me that kind of attention, and I wanted so badly to believe that this was what I'd been waiting for. We were married 8 months later in a courthouse in Knoxville. Opal came. She wore her best dress. She held my hand before I walked in and said, "If it goes wrong, you come home. No questions, no shame. You just come home." I promised her I would. And then I didn't come home for 4 years, because Dominic made sure of it. He moved me across the Tennessee border into a house he'd bought before we met. It was nice, nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived, and at first I thought that meant I was lucky. But within 6 months, the walls of that nice house started closing in. Dominic suggested I cut back my hours at the clinic. Then he suggested I stop working altogether. "I make enough for both of us," he said. "Why are you driving an hour each way to clean up after animals when you don't have to?" He said it gently. He always said things gently. That was the other trick. He never raised his voice. He never hit me. He never did anything that would leave a mark anyone could see. What he did was slower than that. He took over the bank accounts. He put everything in his name. He gave me a credit card with a limit he monitored and questioned every charge I made over $20. He started scheduling things on the weekends Opal wanted to visit. He told me Tamsin, my best friend since 7th grade, was a little too involved in our marriage, and maybe I should give that friendship some space. And I did. God help me, I did. Because when you love someone and they tell you these things softly, with a hand on your cheek and concern in their eyes, you don't see control. You see care. You see a man who wants to protect you. And by the time you realize the protection is a cage, the door has already been closed for so long, you've forgotten what it looks like from the other side. By the time I got pregnant, I was completely dependent on Dominic Falk. No income, no savings in my name, limited contact with Opal, almost no contact with Tamsin. I spent my days in that house, waiting for him to come home from work trips that seemed to get longer every month, cooking meals he'd eat without comment, folding his laundry, and telling myself that once the baby came, things would get better. The baby would fix it. The baby would bring us closer. The baby would give me a purpose that even Dominic couldn't take from me. But the baby didn't fix anything. because the baby was never part of his plan to save the marriage. The baby was his exit strategy. I just didn't know it yet. What I also didn't know was that 800 miles away in a house that leaned to the left when the wind blew hard, my grandmother was sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of photographs, a cell phone full of text messages, and a retired family law attorney named Boyd Sutterman. And they were building something Dominic Falk never saw coming. The pregnancy changed Dominic in ways I didn't expect. I thought he'd become softer. I thought he'd rub my feet at night and talk to my belly and read books about what to expect in the first year. I thought the baby would unlock something human in him that I'd been waiting 4 years to see. Instead, he became clinical, focused, but not on me, on the baby. He went to every single doctor's appointment, not because he held my hand in the waiting room or asked how I was feeling. He went because he asked the doctor questions, specific, detailed questions that had nothing to do with my health and everything to do with custody. He wanted to know how soon after birth a paternity test could be administered. He wanted to know what name would go on the birth certificate and who had the legal right to decide. He asked about hospital discharge procedures and whether both parents had to sign off before a newborn could leave the building. I remember sitting on that exam table in my paper gown, 7 months pregnant, watching my husband interrogate my obstetrician like he was preparing for a deposition. And for the first time, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not sadness, not even anger, just recognition. The slow, sickening recognition that this man was not planning for our family. He was planning for something else entirely. But I pushed it down. I pushed it down because that's what I'd learned to do. 4 years of Dominic had taught me that my instincts were wrong, that my feelings were overreactions, that if I just trusted him and stayed quiet and didn't make things difficult, everything would work out the way it was supposed to. What I didn't know was that 200 miles away, Tamsin Drury was sitting in her car outside a hotel in Knoxville, watching my husband walk through the lobby doors with his arm around a woman who wasn't me. Tamsin and I had been best friends since the 7th grade. She was a postal carrier in Harlan County, tough as leather, honest to a fault, and the kind of woman who would drive 4 hours on her day off because something didn't sit right in her gut. She'd seen Dominic's car at a restaurant in Knoxville 2 weeks earlier while visiting her cousin. He was supposed to be at a sales conference in Nashville. She didn't say anything to me because she wanted to be sure. So she went back. She waited. And on her second trip, she watched him check into that hotel with Corinne Voss, and she photographed every second of it. She didn't bring those photographs to me. She brought them to Opal. I found this out later, after everything was over, and when I asked Tamsin why she went to my grandmother instead of coming to me directly, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Because I knew if I told you, you'd confront him, and he'd talk you out of believing it. But your grandmother doesn't get talked out of anything." She was right. Opal looked at those photographs, looked at the text messages Tamsin had pulled from Corinne's public social media, where she'd been posting about starting a family with the right man and building something real. And Opal didn't cry. She didn't shout. She picked up her phone and called Boyd Sutterman. Boyd was 58 years old, semi-retired, and he'd been a friend of my grandfather's since they were young men working tobacco together. After my grandfather passed, Boyd stayed close to Opal. He handled her will, helped her with property taxes, and checked in on her every few weeks. He was also, as it happened, one of the most respected family law attorneys in the eastern part of the state. He hadn't lost a custody case in 22 years. Opal told Boyd everything: the photographs, the social media posts, the financial control, the isolation, the way Dominic had systematically removed every support system I had. And then she told him what she suspected, that Dominic was going to try to take the baby and leave me with nothing. Boyd listened. Then he said, "Opal, if that's his plan, he's going to move fast after the birth, probably within the first week while she's still recovering and vulnerable. We need to be ready before he makes his move." So they got ready, quietly, carefully, without telling me a single word. Boyd started pulling financial records. He filed requests with the county clerk. He built a profile of Dominic's spending patterns and found 3 bank accounts that didn't appear on any of our joint filings. He contacted Patrice Langford, Opal's goddaughter, who worked as a labor and delivery nurse at the hospital where I was scheduled to deliver. He told Patrice to be watchful, to document everything she saw, and to be ready to act as a witness if the moment came. And then he waited. They all waited. Because the trap doesn't work if you spring it too early. You have to let the other person believe they're winning. Dominic believed he was winning. He had no idea that every move he made from that point forward was being watched, recorded, and prepared for by people he'd never thought to worry about. A grandmother he'd dismissed as a simple old woman, a best friend he'd pushed out of my life, a nurse he'd never met, and a lawyer he wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. I went into labor 3 weeks early on a Tuesday morning. My water broke in the kitchen while I was making coffee, and for a moment I just stood there staring at the puddle on the tile floor, feeling something between terror and relief. Terror because I wasn't ready. Relief because once this baby was here, I told myself everything would finally make sense. I called Dominic. He picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear noise in the background, a restaurant maybe, or a bar. He said he'd meet me at the hospital. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask how far apart the contractions were. He just said, "I'll be there," and hung up. I drove myself to the hospital. 35 minutes on a 2-lane road with contractions coming every 8 minutes, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I got to the labor and delivery floor, a nurse met me at the intake desk. Her name tag read Patrice Langford. She looked at me with calm, steady eyes and said, "You're Jolene Hadley?" Not Falk, Hadley. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just nodded and let her guide me to a room. Dominic arrived 2 hours later. He walked in smelling like cologne and breath mints, which told me everything I needed to know about where he'd actually been. He stood beside the bed for a few minutes, checked his phone, and then said he was going to the waiting room because he couldn't handle seeing me in pain. That was the last time I saw him until after the delivery. I labored for 11 hours. Patrice stayed with me through most of it. She held my hand during the worst contractions. She talked me through the breathing. She wiped my forehead with a cool cloth and told me I was doing beautifully. At one point, between contractions, she said, "Do you have family coming?" I told her my grandmother wanted to come, but lived too far away and didn't drive at night. Patrice squeezed my hand and said, "She's closer than you think." I didn't understand what that meant. Not then. My daughter was born at 11:42 that night. 6 pounds, 9 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and a cry so loud the nurse in the next room laughed and said she had opinions already. They placed her on my chest, and the moment I felt her weight against me, every terrible thing Dominic had ever done to me became irrelevant. Not forgiven, just irrelevant. Because this child was mine, and nothing he could do would change that. When they asked me what name to put on the birth certificate, I said B. Hadley. Not B. Falk, Hadley. Patrice wrote it down without hesitation, without question, and filed it before Dominic even came back into the room. He showed up the next morning with a teddy bear from the hospital gift shop, the kind with the tag still on it that costs $9. He held B for about 4 minutes, looked at her like he was inspecting a product he'd ordered, and then handed her back to me and said he had to take care of some things at home. He left before noon and didn't come back that day. The second day was the same. A short visit in the morning, a few minutes holding the baby. No conversation with me beyond the basics. He asked when I'd be discharged, and when I said probably tomorrow, he nodded and said, "Good, I'll have everything ready." I didn't ask what everything meant because part of me already knew. That cold feeling in my chest, the one I'd first felt in the doctor's office months ago, had spread into my entire body. I was lying in that hospital bed, holding my newborn daughter, and I could feel my marriage ending in real time. Not with a fight, not with screaming or thrown objects or slammed doors, just with absence. Just with the slow, deliberate withdrawal of a man who had already decided I was finished. On the morning of the third day, Opal called. It was early, just after 6, and B was sleeping in the bassinet. I picked up the phone expecting her to ask about the baby, to coo over her, to tell me she was proud of me. Instead, Opal's voice was steady and serious. She said, "Jolene, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to listen and not interrupt and not ask questions until I'm finished." And then she told me everything. The photographs, Corinne Voss, the hotel in Knoxville, the hidden bank accounts, Boyd Sutterman, Patrice, the plan. She'd told me that Dominic was coming today, that he was bringing papers, that his mistress would probably be with him, and she told me exactly what I needed to do when he walked through that door. "You sign whatever he gives you," Opal said. "You don't read it. You don't argue. You don't cry. You just sign it and let him leave thinking he won. Can you do that for me, baby?" I looked at my daughter sleeping in her bassinet. I looked at the door of my hospital room, and I said, "Yes, ma'am." 2 hours after Opal's phone call, the door to my hospital room opened and Dominic walked in wearing a pressed shirt and his best watch, the one he saved for client meetings and important dinners. Behind him, Corinne Voss stepped in like she belonged there. She was wearing heels and a fitted dress, and her hair was freshly done, like she'd prepared for this moment the way a woman prepares for a celebration. Dominic didn't greet me. He walked to the side of my bed, pulled a manila envelope from inside his jacket, and placed it on my lap. He opened it himself, spread the pages across my blanket, and set a pen on top. "Here's how this works," he said. "I'm filing for full custody of the baby. You get whatever's left in the joint checking account, which should cover a month or 2 of rent somewhere. You sign these now, we skip the lawyers, and this stays clean." I looked at the papers. I could see words like dissolution and custodial rights and irreconcilable differences. My hands were shaking, and I let them shake because Opal had told me to let Dominic see what he expected to see. She said, "Let him think you're broken. That's what makes him careless." Corinne stepped closer. She was standing at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, looking at me with the kind of pity that isn't pity at all, but satisfaction wearing a mask. "You'll be homeless by Friday, sweetheart," she said. "He's already moved everything out of the house that matters. Your clothes are in garbage bags. In the garage. You don't even have a car in your name." She said it like she was reading a weather report, like my entire life being dismantled was just Tuesday to her. I looked at Dominic. He was watching me the way he always watched me when he wanted something, with that patient, controlled expression that said he had already decided how this would end and he was just waiting for me to catch up. So I caught up. I picked up the pen. I didn't read a single page. I signed the first one, then the second, then the third. One after another, steady, no tears, no hesitation. I signed every page in that envelope while Dominic's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something I'd never seen on his face before, which was uncertainty. He had built this moment in his head 1,000 times, and in none of those versions did I just quietly sign without a fight. Corinne laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more like a bark than a laugh. "I told you," she said to Dominic. "I told you she was nothing. She doesn't even care enough to read it." I put the pen on top of the signed papers and looked at my husband. I didn't say a word, not one. I just looked at him, and for half a second I saw something flicker behind his eyes, a tiny crack in his certainty, the smallest suggestion that something about this was too easy. But Corinne was already picking up the envelope, already sliding the papers back inside, already pulling him toward the door with one hand on his arm and victory in her voice. "Let's go," she said. "We have things to do." They walked out. The door closed, and the room was silent. Patrice Langford, who had been standing beside my IV stand the entire time, adjusting a drip she didn't need to adjust, straightening a monitor she didn't need to straighten, calmly walked to the door and locked it. She pulled her phone from her scrub pocket, dialed a number, and when it connected, she said, "He signed them too, Miss Opal. Boyd was right. He used the exact language we expected. It's done." She listened for a moment, nodded, and then looked at me. "Your grandmother says she's proud of you, and Boyd is filing the counter motion first thing tomorrow morning." I let out a breath. I didn't know I'd been holding for 3 days. My whole body shook, not with fear, but with release. I reached into the bassinet and picked up Bea and held her against my chest so tightly that she squirmed and made a small sound of protest. "What just happened?" I whispered to Patrice. Not because I didn't know, because I needed to hear someone else say it out loud. Patrice sat on the edge of my bed and said, What happened is your husband just filed documents containing fraudulent financial disclosures, admitted in writing that he initiated the separation, and did all of it in front of 2 witnesses, while his mistress stood in the room confirming the affair. Boyd Sutterman is going to take those papers apart line by line, and by the time he's done, your husband won't have a leg to stand on in any courtroom in this state. I looked down at my daughter. She was staring up at me with those dark newborn eyes that don't quite focus yet, but somehow still see everything. Your great-grandmother sends her love, I told her, and she says we're going home. 6 weeks later, I walked into a family courtroom in Knox County, Tennessee, wearing a dress Opal had sewn for me by hand. It was simple, navy blue, fitted at the waist, and pressed so sharp you could see the creases from across the room. Opal sat in the front row behind me with Bee in her arms, wrapped in a white blanket she'd crocheted during the weeks we'd spent preparing for this day. Tamsin sat beside her, straight-backed, jaw set, looking like a woman who had been waiting a long time to watch something burn. Dominic was already seated at the opposite table with his attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone and shuffling papers like he was still organizing. His argument 5 minutes before it started. Corinne was in the hallway. I saw her through the window as I walked in, sitting on a bench, scrolling through her phone. I learned later from Tamsin that she'd been browsing nursery furniture online. She was that confident. Then Boyd Sutterman walked in, and the temperature of that room changed. Boyd was 58 years old, 6'3", with silver hair and a voice that carried without him ever needing to raise it. He wore a charcoal suit that was 15 years old and fit him like it had been made yesterday. He carried one leather briefcase, no laptop, no tablet, just paper and memory, and 22 years of never losing a custody case. Dominic's attorney looked up, recognized the name on the filing, and stopped shuffling his papers. The judge called the proceedings to order. Dominic's attorney presented his case first, painting a picture of a responsible father who had tried to make the marriage work, who earned the household income, who had been the primary planner for the child's future. He referenced the signed divorce papers as evidence that Jolene had voluntarily relinquished custody. He called it an open and shut case. Boyd stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce evidence that the petitioner's financial disclosures filed with this court are fraudulent." That was the first crack. Boyd presented bank records for 3 accounts Dominic had opened in his name alone over the previous 2 years, accounts that did not appear on any joint filing or on the divorce papers he'd brought to my hospital room. The total across all 3 accounts was $214,000, money he'd siphoned from his salary, his bonuses, and a side account tied to his pharmaceutical commissions, money I never knew existed because he had controlled every financial document that entered our home. Dominic's attorney objected. The judge overruled him. Then Boyd presented the photographs. Time-stamped images taken by Tamsin showing Dominic and Corinne entering a Knoxville hotel together, dated 4 months before Bee was born. He presented screenshots of Corinne's social media posts referencing her relationship with a man she described as almost free, and her excitement about building a real family. He presented Patrice Langford's sworn witness statement describing Dominic's behavior during my hospital stay, his absence during labor, his failure to engage with the newborn, and the presence of his mistress in the room when the divorce papers were signed. And then Boyd played the voicemail. It was a recording Dominic had left on Corinne's phone the night before he brought those papers to my hospital bed. Tamsin had obtained it through Corinne's voicemail system, which she'd accessed using a phone number and default PIN that Corinne had never bothered to change. Boyd had verified its authenticity through a forensic audio analyst and submitted it as evidence 3 days before the hearing. In his own voice, clear as daylight, Dominic said, "Everything's ready. I'm going tomorrow. I'll take the baby, leave her with nothing, and she won't fight it. I've already moved the money where she'll never find it. By next week, you and I can start over like she never existed." The courtroom went still. I watched Dominic's face drain of color. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him, but Dominic didn't respond. He just stared at the table in front of him like the wood grain held some answer that could save him. The judge asked if the petitioner wished to respond. Dominic's attorney requested a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During that recess, Corinne Voss stood up from her bench in the hallway, put her phone in her purse, and walked out of the courthouse. She didn't say a word to Dominic. She didn't look back. Tamsin watched her leave and said under her breath, "There goes the nursery furniture." When the court reconvened, the judge delivered the ruling. Full custody of Bay Hadley awarded to the mother. Spousal support and child support ordered. All 3 hidden accounts frozen and subject to equitable division. The marital home awarded to me. Dominic granted supervised visitation only pending completion of a psychological evaluation. Dominic turned to me from across that courtroom and said, "You planned this." I looked at him the same way I'd looked at him in that hospital room. Calm. Steady. And I said, "No." My grandmother did. I just trusted her. The drive back to Harlan County took 4 hours. Opal sat in the passenger seat holding B against her chest, humming a hymn she used to sing to me when I was small and couldn't sleep. Tamsin drove behind us in her own car, honking the horn every time we passed a county line, like she was announcing our arrival to the whole state of Kentucky. I didn't speak for most of that drive, not because I was sad, not because I was afraid, because for the first time, in 4 years, there was nothing I needed to say, no explanation I needed to give, no lie I needed to swallow, no version of myself I needed to shrink into so that someone else could feel bigger. The silence in that car wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of a woman breathing without permission for the first time in longer than she could remember. We pulled into Opal's driveway just before dark. The porch light was on and Boyd Sutterman was sitting in the rocking chair with a paper bag from the bakery 2 towns over. He stood up when we got out of the car, looked at Bea in Opal's arms, and said, "Welcome home, little one. Your great-grandmother just won you a house, a future, and a whole lot of peace and quiet." Opal swatted his arm and said, "I didn't win anything. I just made sure nobody stole what was already ours." Within a month, I moved into the house in Tennessee. The house Dominic had bought during our marriage, the house the court awarded to me, the house he once used as a cage. I repainted every room. I pulled down his curtains and hung new ones Opal sewed from fabric she picked out herself. Soft yellow for the kitchen, pale blue for Bea's nursery, white linen for the living room where I used to sit and wait for a man who was never really coming home to me. I called Dr. Alton Pogue at the Harlan County Animal Clinic and asked if my position was still available. He laughed and said, "Jolene, I've had a temp filling in for you for 2 years and she's terrible. Get back here before I lose every client I have." I started the following Monday. Tamsin drove me on my first day back and waited in the parking lot until I texted her that I was okay, which was the most Tamsin thing she could have possibly done. 3 months after the court ruling, I enrolled in an online program to begin working toward my full veterinary license. It was something I dreamed about since I was 19 years old, something Dominic had told me was unrealistic, something he said I wasn't smart enough to handle. I'm halfway through the program now, and my grades are the highest in my cohort. Bea is growing faster than I can keep up with. She has my mother's eyes and Opal's stubbornness, and a laugh that fills whatever room she's in. She started crawling early, which Opal says is a sign of a girl who's going places whether you're ready or not. Tamsin is her godmother. Patrice visits on weekends when her shift schedule allows. Boyd comes for Sunday dinner at least twice a month and always brings pie. Always from the same bakery, always pecan because he knows it's Opal's favorite. Dominic moved out of state. I don't know where, and I don't care to find out. He sends the court-ordered payments on time, which tells me his attorney made it very clear what would happen if he didn't. He has not once exercised his supervised visitation rights. Not once. He has never called to ask about Bea. He has never sent a card or a gift or a letter. He walked away from his daughter the same way he walked away from me, completely and without looking back. I used to wonder if that would hurt Bea someday, growing up without her father. And maybe it will. But then I look at the people who are in her life. An 80-year-old great-grandmother who moved heaven and earth to protect her before she was even born. A godmother who drove 200 miles on a hunch because something didn't feel right. A nurse who locked a hospital door and made a phone call that changed everything. And a small-town lawyer who came out of retirement because a woman he respected asked him to. Bea doesn't have a father who showed up, but she has a family that showed up so hard it shook the walls of a courtroom. One evening last week, I was sitting on the porch with Opal. B was asleep inside. The house was quiet, and the sky was doing that thing it does in Kentucky, where the sunset turns everything gold and copper, and you forget for a second that the world has sharp edges. Opal rocked in her chair and said, "He thought being loud made him powerful, but the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who already know how it ends." I think about that every day. I think about how Dominic stood in that hospital room and thought he was the strongest person there. He had the money. He had the mistress. He had the papers. He had every advantage a man can stack in his favor when he wants to break a woman down. And he lost to a 74-year-old seamstress who never raised her voice once. I learned something in those 90 days that I want to leave with you, whoever is watching this right now. Strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like signing a piece of paper with steady hands because the people who love you have already built the safety net underneath. Sometimes it looks like a grandmother making phone calls from a kitchen table. Sometimes it looks like a best friend sitting in a parking lot on your first day back at work just to make sure you're okay. If this story reminded you of someone in your life who fought for you without making a sound, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment right now and tell me about that person. Tell me their name. Tell me what they did, because those people deserve to be talked about, and this is a space where we talk about them. And if this is your first time here on Buddy Saga, welcome. Every story on this channel is about someone who was counted out, pushed down, or written off, and who found a way to stand back up. If that sounds like something you need in your life right now, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if this one hit you in the chest the way it hit me when I lived it, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Send it to your mother, send it to your sister, send it to that friend who's going through something hard right now and thinks nobody is in her corner, because somebody always is, even when you can't see them, especially when you can't see them. My name is Jolene Hadley, and this has been my story. Thank you for listening.